Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tonellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Chris Hammer, former newspaper journalist and foreign correspondent, burst onto the Australian literary scene with his explosive debut novel, Scrublands, in 2018, a book in which we meet the emotionally tormented journalist Martin Scarsden. For those who don't know, Scrublands was a phenomenal success. It rocketed up the bestseller lists, was picked up in the US and in the UK, won awards and was optioned for a screen adaptation. In 2019, Chris followed up on this incredible debut with the second instalment of the Martin Scarsden adventures in Silver, a book which picks up where Scrublands left off and in which we become reacquainted with Martin and his new girlfriend, Mandalay Blonde. Now, in 2020, Chris has delivered Trust, which continues the story of Martin and Mandalay, but which represents a departure from the first two instalments in many important respects. A pacey, action-packed thriller, Trust was a complex and emotionally charged novel. With a cast full of colourful and deadly characters, it's about power and corruption, and at its heart, it's a novel about trust. I was delighted to speak with Chris about his books last year, and am even more delighted to have the opportunity to do so again today. Welcome back to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you, Claudine. So nice to be back.
I wanted to congratulate you on another sensational novel in Trust. How are you feeling about its reception so far? What's the feedback you're getting?
It's been really good. I've been very happy. Good critical response, and it's only been out for 2 weeks today, I guess. So the first week's sales figures were really good too, according to the publishers. So yeah, fantastic.
Now, this story, much like Scrublands and Silver, gets off to a hair-raising start. You really know how to throw Martin and therefore the reader into the deep end. I mean, it's quite incredible. Is this how you resolve to start all your novels, thinking of the most shocking thing that can happen?
Well, often you have a storyline, and one of the choices you have as an author is where you actually start telling the story. So again, in this book, there's a lot of events that lead up to where the reader starts the story. And to an extent, yes, I do want to have a dramatic start, something that's going to fire the imagination of the reader and sort of suck them into the story.
Indeed. So for those who haven't read Trust yet, can you tell us a little bit more about the story?
There's lots of ways of doing that, but I'll start by just giving a setup, if you like. There is a prologue that touches on events that have occurred sometime before the story proper starts. Then we find ourselves back with Martin Scarsden and his young stepson, Liam. They're on a beach in northern New South Wales, where we left them at the end of Silver. So this is a year and a half, 2 years later. They've been having a rather serene life. And then that all abruptly comes to an end. Martin gets a phone call, voicemail, and it's his partner, Mandalay Blonde, or Mandy, just screaming. And then the call's cut off. He races back to their house. Mandy is gone. He believes she's been abducted. There's an unconscious policeman on the floor of their house. And shortly after, Martin learns that a body of another undercover policeman has been found in Sydney. The body of a man that everyone has thought had fled overseas, had stolen millions of dollars and fled overseas and disappeared. But only now his body's been found. And that changes a lot of people's view of what's happened. Meanwhile, we have Mandy, who has indeed been kidnapped, thinking, oh my God, this is my past come to claim me. So yeah, there's a bit going on in the start there.
Yes, indeed. So, yes, you mentioned that the novel starts with a prologue. You're a fan of this, obviously, as a literary device?
Yes and no. Silver doesn't start with a prologue, so it's different than Scrublands and this one, Trust. And part of the reason for that in Silver is, again, there's a rather dramatic opening chapter there, and I felt in that case it was better just to take the reader straight into the story than using that sort of device. So It can be a very effective device, but depends on the story.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is the third novel in the Martin Scarsden series, but it's different from the first two in some important respects. It's not set in a fictional town or in the country as the other two were, but in Sydney. And we have different perspectives in this novel. This time we hear the story from Martin's point of view as well as Mandy's point of view. And Mandy has much more agency in this novel than the first two. So I wondered, could you tell me a little bit more about this and the reasons for these significant departures?
The seed for the book, this might be the best way to explain it. Going back to Scrublands, when I started writing it, I just wanted to write a good crime book. And I thought at that stage that meant a cracking plot, that the plot was the be-all and end-all. But in writing Scrublands, I began to realise other things were at least as important as plot. Things like the setting, the characters, their motivations, but also the relationship between different characters and their emotional journeys. So in Scrublands, over the length of the book, Martin changes. He becomes more self-aware. There's this emotional journey there. And I like that. And so I continued that idea in Silver. So in Silver, there's a lot of crimes and interwoven crime plots. You know, plot is still very important, obviously. But that book is different because in Scrublands, Martin is an absolute outsider and he's motivated simply by trying to get a good newspaper story. In Silver, he's returning to his old hometown. So he's not an outsider. He still has relatives there, people who know him. And the emotional part of the story is him finding out what really happened to his family when he was a child and coming to terms with that. So again, there's that emotional journey. And I realised as I was finishing Silver that Mandy is becoming, by this stage, a much more prominent character in the books. But I realised there was a gap in her backstory. We knew from Scrublands that she left that little town, Riversend, when she left school, 16, 18, something like that. And it didn't return for another 10 years until she came back to care for her dying mother. So there's a 10-year gap there. And so I thought, we know about Martin, we know about his emotional journey, but we really don't know about Mandy's. So I thought, well, if she's run away from this terrible childhood in this remote town, it's pretty unlikely she's going to head for another similar town. Given her age, she's probably going to head to the city. So that was the seed of the idea of setting it in a city. I didn't think a fictional city would work. I just can't make up a big capital city on the east coast of Australia. So it's set in Sydney, although it's a rather impressionistic Sydney. Then I had the issue of what was it that Mandy had been hiding from Martin. This is the theme of, I guess, of the trust. She hasn't trusted him enough to tell him of what she thinks has happened to her in the past. And then he's thinking, well, how can I trust her now if she hasn't told me those things? So I'm thinking, well, it's set in the city, so it's not going to be some sort of small, big country town drama. It's got to be bigger picture. So it ends up being about high-level collusion and corruption, organised crime, money laundering, conspiracies on a grand scale. So the plot suits the setting, if you like, and the setting suits Mandy's emotional state, if you like. Then the issue that came up with that, though, was the first two books are told very much from Martin's point of view. They're not told in the first person, but they're very close to it. So Martin is in every scene. He's the protagonist. He's the person who leads the reader through the story. We can read what Martin is thinking, but no one else. But if this story in Trust was primarily about Mandy, how could Martin be the one telling the story? Because apart from anything else, while he can be quite observant as a journalist, he's probably not very emotionally perceptive, to put it mildly. So I thought maybe I should try writing it from Mandy's point of view. But ultimately, how it ends up, there's 2 points of view. So unlike the first two books. So this time around, You have Martin's point of view and you have Mandy's point of view, and pretty much they alternate chapter for chapter. One from Martin, one from Mandy, and so forth, which gives a quite a marked difference, I think, between this book and the first two. And one of the effects of that, which is unintentional, I was just trying to work out the best way to tell that story, is it increases the pace of the book because the chapters are shorter and you're bouncing between two perspectives. If readers found Scrublands and Silver to be page turners, this one is possibly even more of a page turner because it's got that increased pace. It's possibly a little bit more of a thriller than the first two books because there's more action happening throughout the book as it builds up to a kind of crescendo. So really just starting with that idea of what did Mandy do in those 10 years, deciding that it would need to be set in a city. Everything else flowed as a consequence of that. And so you've got a book which, one, I think you can read as a standalone. So if you haven't read Scrublands and Silver, you can definitely read it as a standalone. But also the people who've read Scrublands and Silver and enjoyed them will enjoy this book. It's not that much of a departure. It's more of a departure in style than in some ways in substance.
I got the sense in reading this that Mandy, she's still quite an elusive kind of character. It was difficult to get to know her in the previous books for obvious reasons because we could only know what Martin could tell us. But in this book, we get to know her a little bit more, and I love that. But even towards the end, just when I think I've got a handle on who she is, she surprises us yet again. Is there more to Mandy that we still haven't discovered?
Look, I think there is. She's quite a complex character. People have asked me, do you find it difficult writing a female character or a character from a female perspective? I would say no to that. The problem with Mandy isn't, for me as a writer, the issue isn't that she's female. The issue is that she's a kind of fractured, inconsistent person. And inconsistent characters are a bit tricky in books because readers typically like whatever the character is like, that they're going to be consistent in some ways. So, but part of that is just a reflection of her not knowing herself properly. So it's a book of her sort of self-discovery in some ways. Really, that's happening in the background, and that's not for me to state as the writer. It's more for the reader to contemplate because up front, it's a book full of action and plot.
Now, as you mentioned, this book is set in Sydney, but like your previous two novels, the setting really is a character. It's moody, secretive and dark with a tarnished underbelly that hides rotten privilege and insidious corruption. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the inspiration for the events of this story.
In describing Sydney and setting it in Sydney, I wasn't setting out to give an objective view of the city. And I think this is true when you read books. If you think of all the books that you've read set in New York or London, Paris, wherever, they all paint a different picture of that real city. And again, in this book, it's like that. So I'm not giving an objective view of Sydney, and I'm certainly not writing about the kind of picture postcard Sydney. So it's not the harbour, it's not the Opera House, it's not Bondi Beach, it's not that sparkling blue city that you see in the tourist ads. In fact, it's almost as if that is denied to Martin. He glimpses it in the distance a few times, but he's in this different world, this rather grimmer world. The book is set, and we talk about this too. It's sort of set immediately post-COVID, so the pandemic is gone. It's not explained how it's gone, whether it's a vaccine or a miracle treatment or lockdown has worked or whatever. But the COVID's gone, but the effects remain. So it's an economically kind of depressed place. The people are struggling. And that suits the mood of the book very much. Returning to your question about the plot lines in it, a lot of them are just made up entirely. They're not based on real events. But I think they kind of bubble up through my subconscious from reading about real events. So political collusion and corruption in New South Wales, Well, it's an ongoing story. It's been a story in the last few weeks. Money laundering is a huge issue internationally. I mean, it could be $1 trillion or something a year that's being washed through not just remote tax havens, but big cities like New York and London, London in particular. There's some real estate speculation and real estate developers trying to win approval for their developments. So all of it's maybe not based on actual real specific events, but it is founded in reality.
Mm.
And so when people read it, hopefully they'll find it credible enough to suspend disbelief and go with the story.
Martin really does have the knack of being at the wrong place at the wrong time, doesn't he? I mean, I think I asked you about this last time, but in trust, it's even more of an issue. I think it's just part of him that he just can't seem to deny, isn't it?
Part of the issue with Martin is, even though he feels himself as growing away from being a journalist, that, there are more important things in life, such as Mandy and his young stepson. Once he gets the whiff of a good story, it's almost like he can't help himself. He's addicted and he's back into it. Often in these books, particularly Silver and Trust, he's actually trying to clear people's names, or he's trying to, find out who killed someone or something like that, for personal reasons. But sure enough, the journalistic instincts kick in. He can see that there's a huge story in this. And one of the kind of amusing things in the books is he's coming to make quite the name for himself as a writer of true crime books, because he keeps getting stuck in these situations where there's a lot of crime. So he's almost like, it's not all downside. He's actually he's actually benefiting in some ways from all this strife he continually gets involved in.
Yeah, he's like a trouble magnet. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. He's not the first protagonist in crime books to have that problem.
This is very true. There is a sense in this book that Martin is pining for the old days. The demise of print journalism and the politics that infects it is really troubling to him. Is this something that you feel too?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of journalists of my generation now look back and see that we live in the golden days of news media in Australia, where the newspapers were so wealthy, and so were the commercial television stations, and the ABC was properly funded. And so you could do really good journalism. There was the resources there. And so there is a kind of a nostalgia there for Martin returning to Sydney, where he doesn't really want to be anymore. But he did spend 20 years based there as a journalist. He still has an apartment in Surrey Hills. There's specific events that happen in the plot that lead him to this, but yeah, there is a little bit of, I guess, of a homage to the old days, the glory days of the news media in Australia.
We talked a little about the pandemic before, and within the writing community, there is a bit of a debate going on about whether you should or can include references to the pandemic in contemporary novels. Were you concerned about that in any way?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a debate. I haven't really heard it, characterized like that. It's more like, how the hell do we deal with this? Do I include it? Don't I include it? I'd pretty much finished my manuscript, polished it as much as I could by the first week or two in February, and sent it off to the publishers. And by this stage, if you cast your mind back, COVID was emerging as a kind of an interesting news story, this mysterious disease killing people in China. And yet it was just a few short weeks later that we all went into lockdown. It was here, that first wave. And so I was editing the book, and my first instinct was, oh, look, I'll just ignore it. People will understand that the book is set last year or something like that. The trouble with that is there's a lot of references in the book to the bushfires of last summer.
Yeah.
And there's, a couple of days in the book. It's set out, that story's told over a period of about a week or so. There's a couple of days when Sydney is cloaked once again in bushfire smoke. And I thought, this will be a bit weird if I'm referencing one big kind of disaster of the past year, but not the other, not COVID. And so I moved the story forward so it's set maybe next winter. it's in this immediate post-COVID world. And there's just a reference here and there. For example, there's one point where someone has a go at Mandy saying, oh, look, it's all right for you guys. You've got money. You've got your house up there in the far north of New South Wales. You can live in splendid isolation. You know, it's all very well for you, but not for us poor buggers who have to, you know, live in the city. So it actually didn't change the mood of the book. It just reinforced the mood that was there. I know other writers have chosen to ignore it for one reason or another. I've just been reading 2 books that are not out yet. A new book by Michael Connelly called The Law of Innocence, the American writer, and a book by Michael Brissenden, the Australian journalist and writer, who's got a book out early next year called Dead Letters. And their books are kind of set as COVID is approaching. And so the reader knows pretty much what the timeline is, where it's set. That works well. But I think it's a real issue for people writing books because, you know, I'd finished my manuscript, if you like, as well as I could back in February, followed by months of editing. I probably last touched it a couple of months before publication. So it's very hard to be finish a book in February and knowing what's going to happen in October. So if you're writing a book now, you've got no idea really where we're going to be in a year's time. You know, is there going to be a vaccine or is there not? So it is a really difficult issue. I think once we're over it, it'll just become a reference point in a way that, you know, for generations of books, you know, in the 50s, the Second World War was this constant reference point in the background, or later on the Vietnam War, events like that were. So, but right now it's a pretty tricky issue, I think, for writers.
So moving away from trust for just a little bit, the last time we chatted, you told me Scrublands was optioned for a screen adaptation. So I wanted to ask you, how was that going?
Look, as far as I know, it's going okay. So what happens is a lot of books get optioned for film or television, and not all of them get made. So what an option is, it's a production company that pays you money, so they've got exclusive rights to develop it. But then there's this long chain of events that has to happen before filming begins. And primarily it's about money. So they need to get some writers and get some money and to develop a treatment, which they then go and take to prospective distributors and buyers, you know, network streaming services, etc. And it's only when they get all that money together, sort of guaranteed, that they can then hire cast and crew and start filming. So it appears, the latest I heard, it's progressing well. There are streaming services and broadcasters interested. They've had writers into writing treatments and, you know, some early screenplays. Whether it goes ahead from here, who knows? I think that internationally, the film and TV production industry has been hit really hard by COVID. Maybe to my advantage is that the Australian production industry is starting to really get back, and a lot of the big American movies are being made in Australia because they can't make them in the US right now, because the financial risk of starting one of those big mega blockbuster type films and then having the cast and crew come down with COVID would be monumental. I guess production is getting up and running in Australia, which is a good thing. On the other hand, there'd be a lot of competition for cast and crew. So it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Yeah. So that's a very long-winded way of saying I think it's progressing well, fingers crossed, but really I've got no idea.
Okay.
So same answer as last year, basically.
Oh, that's terrific. Well, thanks for your honesty on that one. Okay, so with 3 books published now and the successes that you've experienced in the last couple of years, what do you know now that you wished you knew before Scrublands came out?
It's a good question. There's quite a lot. I think there's some things that I know now that I was lucky I didn't know as I was writing Scrublands. Because I assumed Scrublands may well get published, but, just sort of disappear in a few months. I wasn't too precious about trying to please, publishers and readers that may or may not exist. So it gave me a certain amount of freedom. So that was a good thing. I have learned, I think, a lot. I've certainly learned a lot about publishing and how the book industry works. And that's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily make you a better writer. I think there are some aspects of my writing which have gotten better, like some of the craft skills. I pick up, for example, much earlier if something isn't working. I've probably got a bit more perspective on my own work, a bit more objectivity. I'm better at the editing process and getting the best out of the fantastic editors I work with at Allen and Unwin. Crime writers are often split into two camps, the plotters and the pantsers. The plotters being the people who plot their books out and then start writing the narrative, and the pantsers who kind of write by the seat of their pants. They have an idea and they start writing. And I'm much more at that end of the spectrum, the pantsers. So with Scrublands and Silver, I threw out, well, with Scrublands, I probably threw out hundreds of thousands of words, and with Silver, tens of thousands, because as I was writing, I'd get a better idea and the story would evolve. So one of the things I've definitely learned is not to polish too much until I'm sure that that passage, that sequence is actually going to go in the finished product. So don't waste too much time over polishing stuff that in the end is just going to get the flick anyway.
I've been watching your career over the last year and been incredibly impressed with the promotional work that you're doing. And obviously promotional activities this year have been hampered by the virus. The list of cancelled events has been unprecedented, really, including the inaugural Northern Beaches Readers Festival, which we were both going to be involved in.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you've put together a very comprehensive publicity schedule for Trust, a mix of online events, in-person events, blog tours, as well as podcast interviews like this one. So do you feel as if you've had to pivot your marketing strategy because of the pandemic, or are you and your publishers simply responding to demand?
I'm very fortunate in my publisher, Allen and Unwin, has a fantastic publicity team. Also a great marketing team and a great sales team. So normally with the publication of the book, I'd be off travelling around, going to probably all the capitals and some regional areas as well, doing events at libraries, doing events at bookstores, going around meeting booksellers, doing a lot of media, a lot of radio interviews in particular. But Allen and Unwin and other publishers realised early on, one, that travel most likely wasn't possible. And of course, it still isn't. You've had people like, say, Trent Dalton in Brisbane and Craig Silvey in Perth have been able to do a lot of live events there because it's essentially COVID-free, but they haven't been able to cross borders.
Yeah.
But also, Allen and Unwin made the decision that it was a risky thing to do, to plan to tour authors, even if it was possible, because you just didn't know what was happening, where there'd be an outbreak or that. So they've pivoted, and all the other publishers too are doing a lot of Zoom events. So nighttime events. Most nights I've been doing Zoom events, either through libraries or through bookstores. They're very good at social media. In the last 2 years, I've learned a lot about social media. So I wasn't on Instagram when Scrublands came out. So I started going on Instagram. So my Instagram account is mainly about books, but some personal stuff as well. I had an existing Facebook page, which is kind of for friends and family. So I put a little bit of book stuff on that, but I started an author's page on Facebook, which you can do. And I started a website, which I've gotten better at, over the past couple of years. I think I only really started that as Silver was coming out. So social media is a way of staying in contact. It's very useful, I think, for writers and the writing community to stay in touch and see what each other's doing. I don't do Twitter because Twitter's basically in the field of politics, which I'm interested in. It's just so argumentative and can get rather hostile. And there is a limit to the time you want to spend on social media. And I would say to, aspiring writers who often don't have that much time, and they may see people have a very prominent social media profile and think that's the way to become a successful author. I'd kind of counsel against that. And I'd say, look, the way you want to be spending your time writing, and the way you become a successful writer is through your writing. All the other stuff is a little bit ephemeral. It doesn't mean it's irrelevant or doesn't matter, but I don't think it should be a priority. Right now, this month is the month I'd normally be traveling and promoting. So I'm probably doing more on social media than I would normally, but that's just part of the normal promotional cycle.
I always feel a little bit ambivalent about asking this question, especially seeing as how Trust has only just been released. But I'm sure listeners will want to know if you're working on anything else at the moment. And will it be another Martin Scarsden novel?
I am working on something new. I think that it's a good use of time. So as I said, I signed off on Trust probably about 2 months ago. So then there's a hiatus there. So it's a good time to start something else, particularly if you're aiming to get a book out a year. But the other thing for me, psychologically, it's important to move on. Otherwise, while I'm writing the books, I don't have any sort of issues. But just leading up to publication, I get quite anxious about how they'll be received and how it'll go and all of that. So actually, it's kind of good for me just to be working on the next thing.
Yeah.
And as for what the next thing is, I'm really enjoying writing crime novels. I think there's a lot of space in them to do lots of interesting things beyond the plot, as I was saying before. So I'm happy with Trust in that it is a bit of a departure. I've tried new things, the 2 points of view, the different pace of the book. What I'm thinking now, though, is I'm having a bit of difficulty creating a new Martin and Mandy book for the reason I touched on before, is that their emotional life and their relationship and their emotional journeys are a very important part of the books. So if I wrote a book where there's simply objective, sort of somewhat disinterested protagonists, and the book's all about plot and crime, I could write a book like that worked, but it might disappoint some readers who are used to having that emotional strand running through the books. So what I'm thinking at the moment is I'll write a book that's set in the same universe, contemporary Australia, maybe in a fictional town, but it's actually the real place, but featuring some of the characters that are in Trust. So people who read the first 2 books will probably enjoy the fact that it's not just Martin and Mandy who return in Trust. There's a number of the other more minor characters. There's Jack Goffing, the ASIO agent. There's the policeman, Maurice Montefiore, and his offsider, Ivan Lukic. There's some of the journalists, Darcy Defoe, and there's the rather obtuse television reporter, Doug Thunkleton, and Mandy's lawyer, Winifred Barbacombe. They're all back in minor role. Oh, and Martin's old editor, Max Fuller, is in the book as well. So there's some returning characters. So what I'm thinking, I might write a book with some of those as the point of view characters, and maybe even have Martin and Mandy in the book, but not as point of view characters, just having a bit of a cameo in the background, in a chapter or 2. So I'm thinking maybe of going there and at some point, I reckon for sure I'll have another sort of Martin / Mandy book. But what it is, I'm not sure yet. I need the ideas to percolate.
I guess it's going to be a watch this space kind of.
Yes, hopefully I'm back talking to you next year.
Yeah.
Making it sound as if it was all kind of effortless, rather than sort of groping around blindly in the dark looking for an idea.
I have no doubt. It'll be fantastic. So, Chris, you talked a little bit about aspiring writers before, and I don't think I asked you this last time. I wondered if you might have any other tips about writing or the publishing process in general.
There's a lot of good advice out there. One piece of advice is run your own race. The methods that work for me might not work for you. And I like, one of the things I've enjoyed in the past year or so is listening to podcasts like this. I listen to other writers, and you find a lot of points in common, and then they'll say something, you go, what? How can you possibly work like that? So run your own race and you know, develop your own processes. The other thing I'd say is, well, enjoy the writing. Don't get burned by placing too high expectations on yourself. You know, it's a journey, it's not a destination. But the other thing is, in the end, it's the writing that matters, and it's the work that matters. It's not you or how people perceive you. It's how people are ultimately going to judge your work. But before that, you need to concentrate on the work and to write the best work you can. And don't worry about what publishers are going to think, or what sells, or hey, look at that writer, they're doing really well. So don't, you know, for God's sake, don't think, my God, Trent Dalton is doing so fantastically well. He's selling hundreds of thousands and he's winning all these prizes. I'm going to write a book like Trent Dalton's. No, let Trent Dalton write Trent Dalton's book. You've got to write your own book. You've got to write the book in your style and in your voice.
Really sound advice. Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. That's wonderful. Chris, I wanted to congratulate you once again on this wonderful novel. I absolutely loved it, and I hope we get to see more of Martin and Mandalay in the future. Wishing you every success, and thank you for joining me again on Talking Aussie Books.
It's so good to be with you, Claudine. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for this week, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetinellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.